Okay, just to say, so I'm from the UK, but as one taxi driver said, you UK, but not BBC. And in a way, perhaps that's at the crux of what I want to talk about today. But I just wanted to introduce you to my kampong. I come from Willingham. And I also wanted to introduce you to my particular brand of odd English, Winglish or Fenglish. And this is how people speak where I come from, okay? So hello is whoopba. This is what I actually grew up with, the kind of English. Computer being computer. And no, I haven't been shing I ain't. You know, so in a way, sort of a weird non-BBC English. There are so many different kinds of English or odd English in the UK. I just wanted to draw attention to that. I just wanted to make the point as well. Nowadays, we don't hopefully think of, you know, the old argument, wasn't it? Shakespeare is not, you know, a weapon of the oppressor, the old colonial oppressor and so forth. Hopefully, we're bigger and uglier now to know that Shakespeare is a global writer. He was not around when empire was around. He was used as a tool by empire, but he's much bigger. It's like, to kind of paraphrase, I think somebody once said, Singapore is bigger than the PAP. Oh, well, I'm sure that's not true, but you could say that with Shakespeare in a way. Shakespeare is bigger than Britain in some ways. Something else is going on here. Anyway, I fell in love with Singlish. I think it was in 2008, and there was a taxi driver who picked me up at NIE, and the thing he said to me, it's pouring with rain, and he said, "What? Raining dog and cat?" And I thought, in a way, just hearing this made me think something interesting is kind of happening here. Whether that's Singlish or not, I don't know, but it started me kind of thinking about Singlish anyway. Anyone who would say that Singlish has got nothing to do with literature, I would point them to perhaps Harris Sharma's Off-Centre, and I think Saloma's speech at the end of that play. I think it shows the potential and power of Singlish. Things that can't be said in so-called good English that that's promoted here, I think can be said in Singlish. In some ways, Singlish to me seems better than English. In many ways, it's a development rather than a degeneration of English. The model that we're using for this project, so we've got the snappy title, hopefully we can sell it, Shakespeare in Singlish. Our idea is that we are going to translate or retell Shakespeare's complete works in Singlish and sell it at Changi Airport, schools, everywhere. Just like they've pushed on us, haven't they? 11 stories. You remember that big push? Everyone must have 11 stories and the guidebook. Come on, gooder. Hopefully we can do the same with Shakespeare in Singlish. It is our kind of idea. Okay, but there are models for this. Charles and Mary Lamb, over 200 years ago, wrote Tales from Shakespeare. And exactly the same thing is happening. What's happening here? Charles and Mary Lamb, quite strange customers in some ways, even though we might look at them as in quite po-faced ways. They just retold the stories for children. It isn't the Shakespeare text. It's a kind of appropriation, but it's giving children a flavour of Shakespeare, access to Shakespeare, which kind of is important. It begs questions as well about Shakespeare. It's not merely language, it's also something else that's kind of going on with him. Bloody good stories, I would think. That's an important part, perhaps, as well. Okay, just to say some other examples are these as well. What happens to Singlish when it meets Shakespeare? What happens to Shakespeare when he meets Singlish? I think there's almost like some kind of atomic reaction happens. Something quite exciting happens when these two forces come together. They get stretched and morphed into something quite peculiar, wonderful. And recently, I've been listening to this beat comedian called Lord Buckley, and he is a kind of precedent in a way. He was around before the hippies. There were the beatniks in the 1950s in America, and he tried to translate Julius Caesar into beatnik English. So I think this is interesting. Julius Caesar's speech here. You remember, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. What happens here? Is this some kind of degeneration, or is something quite interesting happening to Shakespeare in this kind of example? So I just like that last line. Okay, yeah, Brutus digs that he has eyes for powers, and Brutus is a solid cat. And I'm thinking of this in the context. I mean, we're having a bit of laugh about this, but something quite serious has happened. What has happened to Shakespeare in the last 20 years in Singapore? He has become the marginalised of the marginalised. if somebody had tried to kill off a subject intentionally, I don't think they could have done a better job than they have done in the last 2 decades with literature, how it has just shrunk. And with Shakespeare, as part of that, he has shrunk as well, almost to, at one stage, and I'm not spinning you a yarn here, I remember at least twice occasions being in taxis, talking to old taxi drivers, as well as their wonderful stories of experiences with gangsters and prostitutes in Geylang. They were able to give me sustained quotations, and quite impassioned quotations, from Shakespeare. I'm just wondering how many students nowadays could do that. Right, okay, just some other precedents close to home. We've got Rex Shelley's Sounds and Sins of Singlish, a very interesting book to look at if you get a chance to see that, in which he kind of makes fun of, the not the limitations, but the oddities of Singlish, but he also kind of slightly makes fun of the slightly anal kind of approach that perhaps the powers that be have it in Singapore have towards English and so forth. The idea that it has to be such a, sort of, as Ken was saying, it has to be such a functional, mathematic thing that in a way is killing such a, wonderful, potentially dynamic language. Right, some other examples. What about how much literature is written in bad English? You can imagine a lot of officials coming along saying, that's not English, that's not how it should be. But if you think about this, Robert Burns, To a Mouse, if you've read that, that's more broad than Singlish. You think of William Barnes's poetry, you might not be familiar with that, but that's written in a rich Dorsetshire accent. And Thomas Hardy and Philip Larkin, no mean people, thought he was, the bee's knees. They thought really he was writing, extremely profound and interesting poetry. He was their favourite, this kind of dialect poet. But also James Kelman's How Late It Was, published in 1994. It was a Booker Prize winner. You may not know this, but Singapore has a real fixation about a Singapore writer winning the Booker Prize. And I have a prediction, I have a feeling that that it would be more likely that Singaporean would win the Booker Prize if the book was written in Singlish than if it was written in the supposed received English that we are kind of stuck with at the moment. Okay, right, almost finished. I know I'm going on a little bit, but think about, what about this? Singaporean works deploying Singlish. Singlish is already in the canon, people. We can't escape. We're already infected. Okay, but the Singaporean canon itself is full of very interesting Singlish texts. And I would, draw your attention to this poem, Forever Singlish, which I think really does make a kind of statement. I think this is something that would be quite interesting to look at in your schools. It's not just exercise in Singlish, it really is a manifesto for Singlish, written by a Singaporean over 20 years ago. Right, now, very quickly, just to talk about how did this Shakespeare in Singlish project start? Well, I was teaching some Year 4 drama students, and I just got this very lame idea. I'm not a genius, and I just thought, wow, come on, why don't we try and translate some of Midsummer Night's Dream into Singlish? And they had a go, and I got them to read some back. And one girl in the class, a very modest girl who didn't speak very much, suddenly read out this very rich kind of interpretation or reworking of one of the mechanical scenes. You know, when the mechanicals in Midsummer Night's Dream are planning the lamentable tragedy of Pyramus and Thisbe, acting it out, and it just took on, for me, a whole new life. Obviously, it's not Shakespeare's words, but what Einie had done with Shakespeare's words, I thought was phenomenal. And it wasn't just me, everybody was kind of quite shell-shocked about what happened there. And I think that's interesting, isn't it? Maybe this is a way for Singaporeans to reclaim Singlish, but also a way to reclaim Shakespeare. And it's funny to think how the two are similar in England, in Singapore at the moment, isn't it? Both of them. Why have Shakespeare and Singlish been so marginalised? Is it for educational reasons, or is it, well, you know the answer to that. Okay, anyway, I was just thinking that you could say, if you're thinking of a kind of justification for this, I think Charles and Mary Lamb, in their Tales from Shakespeare, make a very good point. They're saying that really, you know, you need a way into Shakespeare. And perhaps Shakespeare in Singlish for Singaporeans could be like this, providing young readers with a few hints and little foretastes of the great pleasure that awaits them when they come to the rich treasures from which these small and valueless coins are extracted, pretending to no other merit than as faint and imperfect stamps of Shakespeare's matchless image. So ultimately, if this did happen, if this project does happen, it would be the complete works of Shakespeare into Singlish. So it means that any student, they don't have to go to Raffles to have a knowledge of Shakespeare. Okay? It could be somebody, heaven forbid, in a neighbourhood school in Woodlands, could have a knowledge of the complete works of Shakespeare on one level. Okay, just to, I've been quite interested in the kind of, I've been compiling a glossary from these kind of retellings, and just, for me, it's such an education. I'm learning about Shakespeare, but I'm also learning about the value and richness of Singlish. Think about it in this way. I'm trying to think of a wonderful kind of analogy to kind of talk about this. It seems almost that Singlish is being given a workout on the cross-trainer that is Shakespeare. You can see it almost that way, that Singlish is almost kind of being expanded in some wonderful way through this. But what's happening to Shakespeare when Singlish meets him? That's a question I still need to look at a little bit. So I'll just end on this note, just to kind of misquote that poet that we just looked at. So, Singlish and Shakespeare forever. Okay? And so now perhaps we could move into the performance. Oh yes, that's the point I wanted to make as well. That I found that it's wonderful on the page, we're reading it here, but these kind of retellings live far more in performance. Think about, before we had the wonderful Channel 5, probably one of the best kind of TV channels in the world, I'm sure. But before we had that, you know, in Singapore, people used to go down to the riverbanks, didn't they? And there were professional storytellers. It used to be an art in Singapore. And in a way, maybe we're bringing a little bit of that back. So maybe, can we move more?